Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our December meeting of the Transportation and Economic Leadership Group. Mayor? Vice Mayor Lott sends his regrets. He's not available to join us today. What we're going to do today is really present 4 speakers, and we're really setting up for the beginning of January discussion. In January, we're going to start to bring you what I call packages, which are groups of projects clustered around key economic spaces or a cluster of key economic spaces. So we'll ask you in January to start discussing which of these projects make sense and how you view them. Based on your feedback in that, then we will start to take those projects and do business planning in terms of how could we pay for them, what they'll cost, and all that. So beginning in January, we'll actually be into the project mix. In preparation for that, we prepared this agenda today. And what we're trying to do today is to really walk this entire graphic. Our first presentation will be about transportation from Dr. Steve Paulzine at Cutter. And what's distinctive about his presentation is he's going to be talking about comparing Hillsborough County to other competitive sites, other communities in which you compete economically, either you currently compete or which have standards that folks would like to emulate. So Steve will present that data so we can understand where this county stands in relationship to people you're in economic competition with. Our second 2 presentations are really about economic development and the key economic development spaces. Beth Alden will present about the current economic spaces and what the job growth looks like there and what the transportation issues could be or are. And then following that, Ron Barton will present about competitive sites, which are the emerging key economic spaces. So our intent here is to have a good understanding of the key economic spaces in the county, both from the view of job growth and from the transportation issues that will be there. Our last presentation is really in the land use area, and Melissa Zarnetti will present that and its results of the Imagine 2040 in terms of where it is now and what that might mean in terms of how you choose to make land use decisions and the impact on transportation. So that's what our agenda is. We hopefully have a full one for you. At any point, the information just goes into overload and we need a break, just wave at me and we'll pause for a moment because it is a lot of stuff we're going to try and go through. Any questions before we begin? Seeing none? Steve?
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in this capacity. You do have a handout of what I'm going to cover. Mr. Marlowe will collect those before the quiz at the end, so take your notes on them now. I'm going to go through a variety of items here. One of the key issues that comes up that's really the genesis for your discussion is the quality of mobility likely to impact attractiveness for new residents or businesses relative to some of the competing locations that folks might choose to move to and set up their businesses in. And additionally, how do we compare in specific areas? And we'll page through some material demographics, commuting measures, transportation spending, roadway capacity and use, congestion measures, some safety data, and then some transit accessibility and transit performance measures. When I use the data, we have a couple of different geographic reference contexts. Some of the data is available at the county level. Wherever possible, I use county level data. Sometimes the data is available at the city level. Sometimes it's available at either the metropolitan statistical area, which is the 4 counties, other times the urbanized area, which is the shaded areas, and each different data source has different references. The first area is the basic demographic comparisons, and you'll see across the top of this table, these are the Pierce City samples that we pulled data for. These represent some areas that staff here at the county indicated are particular sites that often individuals talk about as being in competition with Hillsborough County. Others are from the partnership report card that they do, the peer cities they use in their report card. And then I threw in a few others that are well-known transit cities, Portland and Salt Lake City. And if you look through this data, you'll notice a number of characteristics. Hillsborough column is on the far right. Generally, we're slightly older than the other metro areas, but interestingly, we're a little bit younger than the average for the country. And that's fairly typical. The southeastern, in particular, urban areas are a little bit newer, a little bit younger than the country as a whole, and we're on the high end of that. We do have higher poverty levels than peer cities and a little bit lower average income than most of them. But as you can see in looking across that spectrum, we're not dramatically out of line in any particular area relative to some others. Another observation is we've got slightly more individuals without high school education, but again, worse than the peer cities, but a little better than the national average. So in total, we're relatively similar to peer cities. This comes from the American Community Survey 2012 data. Households with no workers and commuters. You can see in the lines across the page, the horizontal red lines are typically shown at the county level, and the geographic references are for the city in the region, but the data here is for core city, core county, and metropolitan statistical area. And as you can see, we have slightly higher levels of households with no workers. That means about 27, 28% of the households in Hillsborough County don't have anybody going to work, so obviously they're not crowding the roads during rush hour. They have a little bit more discretion in terms of when they want to travel, and we're a little bit higher than the peer cities, which is probably partially related to age and income as well. In terms of households with no vehicles, again, we're a little bit above the norm of other urban areas that we're competitors with, but a little better than the national average. It's about 7% of households in Hillsborough County have no household vehicle and hence are dependent on alternative means of travel. If you look at work at home, we're a little bit above the national average. Almost 5% of folks that are in the workforce work at home, report working at home, and we're fairly close to the peer cities in this characteristic. There are some that are considerably above it, Atlanta, Austin, for example, but others that are similar below our level in terms of working at home characteristics. One that we hear about a lot is travel time, commute time. We're at about 26 and a half, 26 minutes for both the metropolitan statistical area and Hillsborough County. It's a little bit above the group and just a tad above the national average, but we're talking, less than a few minutes different across the group. This is a relatively tight set of numbers across the country. We're clearly not an outlier, but over the years we've moved up from slightly below to slightly above the national average. Transit commuting. Here we are more of an outlier. We're below most of the peer cities. We're at about a little bit over 1% in Hillsborough County, people getting to work on public transportation. Nationally, that number is 5%. Florida cities tend to be all below, as do southeastern and newer cities that develop predominantly after auto availability in the freeway system. And you can see there are some other communities with fairly dramatically higher transit commute mode shares than we have here in Hillsborough County. Average commute time is in line with or slightly above peer cities. Slightly more zero-vehicle households, slightly higher share of households with no commuters, slightly lower share of work-at-home commuters, but again, not a dramatic difference between us and peer cities. This data happens to be household spending on transportation. This is one that had gotten a lot of attention in the media over the past several years here, and we're basically in line with peer communities. You'll see in the bottom graph there, the hot pink line, Tampa's data spiked up in 2001. Again, this is sample survey data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that was the basis for a fairly widely distributed report that found us abnormally high, but we dipped right back down again, and as of 2004, we're no longer covered in that sample that the Consumer Expenditure Survey covers. were not reported as a separate metropolitan area. We do have a little bit lower incomes than normal, so when you look at transportation spending as a function of either income or household spending, we tend to be slightly above average in that because we've got basically similar levels of transportation spending as other communities. Many of the costs, interest rates, car prices, et cetera, are national scale prices and don't change very much over geography. We have relatively high insurance costs here. We also tend to drive less and spend less on fuel and oil than other communities and less time in our vehicles than other communities. But we net out about normal in terms of spending and actually a little below normal or a little above normal in terms of percent of household income spent on transportation. Another area that gets a lot of attention, particularly in the media, is congestion rankings. There's currently 3 kind of well-utilized national resources that report on congestion levels. The most typical one is the Urban Mobility Report that comes out of the Texas Transportation Institute. They show us ranking 27th highest out of 101 U.S. metro areas. They're updating that report. That should be out early in the new year, and we'll see if that's changed any. INREX is a data company that also compiles rankings in all across North America, and in the 105 metro areas that they looked at, we rated 22, and higher is not good, higher is bad on congestion ratings. And TomTom also produces an index of transportation congestion, and they rated as 12 out of 59 metro areas that they happen to have sample data for. Here's those rankings, and again, we're on the low end of the peer group, not significantly out of line. There's a number of areas that are worse than us, but we're certainly not standout in either direction, but slightly more congested than the peer cities on average. Here's another one of the specific measures, and there are several that different people use. Annual hours of delay per auto commuter. In this particular measure, we're about in line with most of the peers in that measure of congestion. The next few graphics are important. They speak to the intensiveness of the use of the roadway system. How busy is it? And this measures busyness in terms of daily vehicle miles of travel per lane mile. So the way to think about this is for every mile of travel, how many cars pass over that piece of concrete or blacktop every day. And here you can see we're among the highest with relatively high levels of roadway activity volume on the interstate system, and we are the highest on the principal and minor arterial system. So if the positive spin is our infrastructure is being well utilized, but obviously it suggests that it's crowded and in need of additional capacity as demand changes over time. This is a measure of how much transportation infrastructure we have, lane miles per 100,000 people. On the principal and minor arterials, we're in line with or a tad above our peers, and this is metropolitan statistical area data. And for freeway and interstate, we're the lowest of the peers. Again, if we could do Hillsborough independently, we might do a little bit better, but this is the full region here. And again, the fewest freeway lane miles of capacity per 100,000 people, suggesting obviously a capacity constraint. Again, high level of arterial utilization and second highest level of freeway utilization, lowest amount of freeways per 100,000 persons, and a relatively average level of arterials. And the next bullet point I would draw your attention to accommodate an additional 500,000 persons in the region would require 208 lane miles of freeways and 800 lane miles of arterials to provide the same amount of infrastructure per capita as we have today. In other words, if we just increase those numbers proportional to the change in population, and this is at the regional level, so the 500,000 is a modest long-range forecast at the regional level. It suggests we need some pretty substantial increases in infrastructure capacity just to maintain current levels of roadway capacity. If you look at fatalities, if you've, as residents of the area, I'm sure you've noticed over the years, we make the paper often on safety data, and we're amongst the highest, only exceeded by Jacksonville in terms of fatalities. This used 3 years of data averaged together, 09 through 11. Southeastern part of the country is less safe than the country as a whole. In Florida and Hillsborough in particular are amongst the worst in the country in terms of safety data. Here's bicyclist data where we were top ranked, which is obviously bad in terms of fatalities in this 3-year period. And pedestrian fatalities, second to Orlando, only exceeded by Orlando in terms of safety performance over that 3-year period in this region. Yeah, and when you look at safety, obviously we're bad, but there's all kinds of things that contribute to that. There's often a temptation to attribute it to either roadway capacity or roadway design characteristics. Those are certainly a piece of it, but there's a host of other factors. It's tourism, visitors, it's tired tourists, it's strangers, it's population characteristics. Things like homelessness and substance abuse, dementia, et cetera. All of those factors collectively are things that contribute to the safety profile, and those are characteristics, some of which are frequently occurring in this part of the country.
Yeah, I noticed that it's the 3 Florida cities that top each of those charts.
Yes.
So, what is the message there?
Yeah, it goes back and forth, and there are other things that have been looked at. We tend to have mild weather, so people tend to walk more after dark in Florida than other places. There's a number of other factors. Street lighting in this county is an issue. There's a host of issues. They're not all physical facility issues, but the collective performance is obviously a concern.
In addition, have you looked historically back at Florida to see if the trends have been growing or decreasing since the changes in the state requirements on automobile inspections and the education and proficiency requirements that used to be in place for acquiring a driver's license?
Safety data tends to change relatively slowly. There's a number of things, graduated licenses, et cetera, that are occurring. We've historically been amongst the worst performers. I didn't specifically look at a trend for this or attribute it to other things that are going on. There are other things that are occurring as well out there that affect it. But it's, like I said, usually there's lots and lots of factors. It's just a combination of enforcement, training, physical design, population characteristics, et cetera. And typically safety programs have a multifaceted strategy of attacking a number of those. I'm going to turn now to talking about some transit characteristics. This particular graphic is accessibility via transit, but this one is the share of working age residents with access to transit. This is from a Brookings Institute report that again was widely reported in the media, and you'll see here they have 2 particular measures that they use. The blue measures are the share of the working age residents near transit stops. And you'll notice in this that we do relatively well. In other words, the availability of our bus service in proximity to the population is pretty good as a region. However, if you look at the green bars, it's the share of jobs reachable via transit in 90 minutes. That's the one that there was a fair amount of media attention to, and we don't do particularly well in that. We're impacted significantly. I was on the peer panel when this report was developed. Again, this is a metro area study, so as what this means is folks from South County can't get to Pinellas in 90 minutes on transit. They probably can't get there in 90 minutes by car either, but we're particularly impacted by the presence of Tampa Bay and the dispersion of employment and population in the region, and hence that accessibility to opportunities. We're among the more dispersed population metropolitan areas in the country, and that shows up in the measure of what share of jobs can you get to in 90 minutes. This is service frequency, minutes between vehicles, and as you know, folks know that are involved with transit, you know, more service is better. We're amongst the poorer performers amongst the peers here in terms of waiting time. You typically experience waiting for a bus. Higher is worse in this particular area. This is a graph of the overall trend of performance of transit in Hillsborough County. The red number up there, the one that I'm proud of and the community should be, and certainly the Hart folks, since 2000, ridership has increased 80% on public transit in Hillsborough County. The dotted line in red slightly below that shows a plus 10%, that's the national trend on ridership increases. This has been a relatively positive period of growth in transit ridership, but we beat the national average by 8-fold in terms of percent increase in transit ridership over that time period. The green line is the increase in transit service that's provided to the public, and since 2000 we've increased service measured in vehicle miles of service on the street by 33% in this community. Nationally, service has gone up 36%. So what this is saying is we haven't expanded service as much as the rest of the country, but in spite of that, we've grown ridership 8 times as fast as the rest of the country. It's pretty stunning differential performance. And as one might guess, if you grow ridership at that pace relative to service, you're getting much more productive. On the other hand, if you look at the national trends, where ridership was up 10%, service was up 36%, that's getting less productive. So comparatively, we're beating the socks off of them, technical terms. This is total annual operating expenditures per resident. This is how much money is invested in transit service per person in Hillsborough County. $50. $50 a head is spent on transit service. And it's, as you can see, similar to a few peers and dramatically below some other peers. Places like Atlanta and Portland are spending 4 and 5 times as much per capita on public transportation. And this is just operating costs. This isn't capital costs or infrastructure. This is just service expenditures. So again, we're a laggard. We're not alone at that level of spending, but we're certainly well below most of the peer communities. And when we spend that money and get service, this gives you an idea of how much service we're getting. Basically, we're putting 6 miles of service per person out on the street, and again, as you'd expect, we're significantly below a number of our national peers, in line with a few, but certainly well below many of them. When you look at use of transit, we're closer to the peers, but there's certainly some places that have dramatically higher use, and a few that are 2 times or 3 times, Dallas, Charlotte, for example, Austin, the level of use of transit that we are.
What criteria did you use to determine who were our peers? Because I noticed there's no northeastern and no north central.
Right, and we picked
all south except for Portland.
Right, and we picked communities that are competing with us for population and jobs. If I were looking at transit peers alone, I might pick a different set of folks, but this was to look at communities that tend to be competitive with us in terms of economic development and opportunity. And so that's the choice. And like I said, I did throw in Portland as a transit city just to give a perspective there, in Salt Lake City. And Atlanta is one that the partnership uses in some of their work as well. So I did pick some cities, Dallas. Both of those are significantly larger, but they are areas that at the regional scale we're compared with quite frequently. In terms of the efficiency of delivering service, cost per revenue mile of service, we're right in line and below many of the peers. Now, if I'd added Northeast cities to this, we'd be cheap, or California cities, we'd be cheap. But we're relatively in line with the cost of providing service to most of our peers. And you'll notice there's both red lines on this for rail, and yes, the streetcar counts. It is reported in national data. Anybody that looks at Tampa data and compares this across the country, we do have our 2.3, or is it 6 miles now of streetcar, 2.7 miles of streetcar that is reported and counted in our data sets as they're reported nationally. In terms of the effectiveness of the service, that's how many people get on per mile of service. We're right in line with our peers in this, and this is an area where a decade or so ago we weren't in line, we were laggards. But as ridership's grown and service hasn't grown very much, our productivity's improved to the point where we're very competitive with peer cities now. Investment in transit and hence transit service availability and ridership per capita is clearly below levels in peer cities, sometimes several times below their performance levels. Transit service delivery cost is comparable, and I might note the data here is 2011 data. That's what's available on the national peers. Since then, we've had 2 years of even higher ridership and even lower operating costs, so our productivity numbers have improved some even since the 2011 data as we move into fiscal year 2014. And service utilization is comparable to other cities. Some overall takeaway points. The region is relatively similar to peers with respect to most demographic characteristics, slightly poorer and older, less active in the labor force than peer cities. The region's relatively similar with peers with respect to transportation performance indicators. However, we have poor safety, are among the more congested, and have a modest supply of freeway capacity and transit service. The geography of the region, Tampa Bay, impacts accessibility, and if one expects regional accessibility, or one cannot expect regional accessibility to be comparable to monocentric cities. So I figured I'd suggest some specific tactics here for improving the region. I brought in some heavy equipment, took the map, did a little work, and now we're much more comparable to peer cities.
Still dredging in film.
It takes care of some other, port, baseball, other problems as well. But when we do compare ourselves in transportation statistics, it's important to realize that we're not a kind of classic monocentric city. Our transportation network connectivity is partly dispersed simply because of not only Tampa Bay, which is 400 square miles right in the middle of the economic community, but we've got lots of other wetlands and water bodies and other things that complicate the design and the orientation of our transportation network. And so hence we're not strictly comparable to other cities, and folks need to use some caution in making comparisons. Overall, roadway congestion levels are a concern and at risk of rapid deterioration if forecast population growth is not accompanied by significant capacity improvements. Congestion is one of those things that it's not a kind of a linear relationship. It's a little bit of kind of straw that broke the camel's back. A little more traffic can make things a lot worse. So there is a sensitivity to increased demand where things can deteriorate quite rapidly as demand increases. And we're at a point in the curve where we need to be very, very careful, because if demand increases, system performance could deteriorate quickly. There's not a lot of reserve capacity in our transportation system. Our system's intensively used compared to peer cities. Additional roadway travel will require additional capacity to avoid serious deterioration in mobility and implicitly economic competitiveness. Transit service is limited. That impacts the opportunity for those dependent on transit in terms of frequency and quality and span of service. And it also diminishes the likelihood that transit would be attractive to travelers who have an alternative or an auto available to them. And finally, continued investment in safety is certainly prudent in light of the overall performance. And with that, that wraps up the summary data I provided. If you've got questions now or later, you all know how to reach me. So.
Any questions at this point? Mr. Merman?
Thank you, and thank you, Steve. It's a very good presentation. I just want to ask if you are able to do this kind of research, if depending on what transportation modes we come up with to connect everything around us, is there any way to determine how many cars we could take off the road that would make those transportation alternatives cost effective for us?
There are ways to
Or buses?
evaluate the impact of that service. It is complicated. One of the things that, for example, transit can do, obviously it can take a person that would be in a car and put them on a bus, but it can sometimes encourage people to live and locate in locations that means not only do they use transit more, but they might walk more, bike more, have shorter trips because they chose to live in a corridor with good public transportation. So the full kind of synergistic impact of all of those consequences are kind of hard to capture without doing kind of scenario analyses. And that scenario type testing is the kind of thing that frankly you'll hear about in some of the subsequent presentations today. So yes, we can look at the differences there and understand what share of folks would switch modes, but also people, like I said, make shorter trips, use bike, walk more, do other things if they locate in a more intensively developed urban transit-friendly area.
Thank you.
Chairman Shaw?
I was curious, the demographic profile trends. We're relatively older. 36 is the median age. More on the higher side. But are we trending younger? I've lived here all my life, so my observations are just what I see. But my sense is, maybe because I'm getting older, so everyone's looking younger.
I appreciate that.
But it seems like we are attracting a younger, more professional group that before seemed to want to go somewhere else. Is there any way of measuring that? How do we?
Yeah, I mean, we could look at the change in median age over time. Median age tends to move relatively slowly. You almost want to look at the cohort distributions by age and see what's going on. We do have, I think, a relatively high young population, probably a more modest working age population than a larger older population. And there are big differences between Hillsborough and Pinellas as well if you start looking at the age profiles. I think it will be important in the longer term when we look at that extra 500,000 plus folks that might move to this region by the long-term plan time frame. What's the nature of that? Is that young working folks? Is that retirees, et cetera? And I think it'll be important to understand that because that has a real different implication. Retirees bring jobs with them because of the service and support functions that they attract, but it's different than young folks chasing job opportunities that then, create attract other population for service and support jobs.
Dr. Posing, let me ask you, how old is this? Let me ask this question. I'm not trying to get on a racial issue here, but you have 73% of Hillsborough County is white. Does that include Hispanics as white also?
Yeah, they split up the data collection Now they've got race and ethnicity as two separate categories. They did that post-2000 census. So yeah, that would not
Okay.
include
Now, I
Hispanics.
was gonna
That's
say, if we
correct.
take 73% white and we have 25% Hispanic,
Yeah, no, you're correct.
I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Okay.
A new meaning of the term minority. Any other questions? Thank you, Steve.
If I could make one other comment, this is what data says about mobility and the performance of the transportation system in the region. Part of the perception that we communicate to the broader country, including those folks that we want to attract here, are what we say about it and what you say as leaders. And I think it's important, oftentimes in the zeal to improve transportation, we're quick to find fault with what we have. The fault registers, the relative comparability doesn't necessarily. So I would certainly encourage folks to understand the broad spectrum of how we perform and how we actually compare in the data, and to paint an image that's the image we want people to see, including the image of what we're planning for and moving to in terms of a vision. But I think it's important because there's been an awful lot of doomsday type language that's frankly not borne out by the data. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Beth comes up. Beth is going to present to you some configurations of key economic spaces and the job growth and some of the transportation impacts. What I do want to communicate too is that this is a select set. As we work on developing packages for you, we may cluster some things in different ways. So I don't feel like this is the only configurations we'll be looking at. So Beth, if you will.
Thanks so much for having me, Beth Alden, with the staff of the Metropolitan Planning Organization. And Dr. Polzin gave you kind of the big picture order of magnitude of what kinds of capacity improvements should we be thinking about as we're looking towards the growth that we'd like to see happen in our county. And I think one of the numbers that he threw out there was 800 lane miles of arterials if we're going to be adding 500,000 people. That 500,000 people would take several decades to get here, but it does take a while to plan those major capacity projects, as you know. And so that's why we start looking out to those horizon years, a couple decades out, when we're doing our long-range transportation plan. And we're right at the beginning of an update of that long-range plan process for the Metropolitan Planning Organization. And so what I'd like to talk with you about today is what types of transportation investments should we be identifying that would best support our economic activity centers. And so that's what this presentation focuses on. And I'm not going to go over every single bullet point in the presentation because we are just sort of at the beginning point of this testing process and this identification of possible projects. But I would invite anybody in the audience to pick up a copy of a handout of the slides on their way out because there's a lot of details that I won't go through everything. So the long-range transportation plan process does use a region-wide travel demand model. So that we'll be able to answer some questions like, well, if we invest in transit over here, or if we invest in roadway expansion over here, what benefit might it have, both in terms of roadway level of service? Does it change the congestion level? How many people might use that road or that transit segment? So we are working with our neighboring counties to have that region-wide model. And so we're using together this generalized process that you see on the screen, where January through April of 2014 we'll be analyzing needs. In other words, taking some ideas for transportation projects and testing them in the model to see what benefit they have. April through June we'll be looking at, in aggregate then, what performance outcomes might we have. And then later in the year, I'm doing some outreach, and the goal is to have an affordable plan by next November. So our needs assessment does have a number of different categories in it, and what we're focusing on today is not just preserving existing systems or looking at the crashes. we're looking at this one bucket that we're calling supporting the growth of economic activity centers. So this is just one piece of the whole puzzle. And I'm going to walk through some of the different geographic areas of Hillsborough County so we can start talking about what are some of the needs both today and in the future. This is a map that we looked at a previous meeting, just identifying some existing clusters of jobs in Hillsborough. And I'm going to go through kind of groups of them so we don't have to go through them one by one.
Mr. Devon?
Yeah, Beth, is there a reason on this that we left out the university area, or does that come up later?
Come up later. We're showing you various configurations,
Okay.
and as we work through,
Okay, 'cause
not
when I-
necessarily today, but we'll look at all the configurations in the process.
Because you are aware, I'm sure, that that's the highest number of jobs in the county in one area.
Yep, and I
Also
think you'll
the
see it in
highest
a later slide,
employment.
right?
Yes.
That's
You'll
what I
see it
said,
on a
the
later
highest
slide.
number of jobs. Yeah,
Jobs and jobless,
jobs,
and both.
employment.
Okay.
Well, we can start with the university area if you'd like.
No, I was just looking, as long as you're gonna touch on it, that's fine. But I was looking at this slide and,
Yeah, let me be clear, at the process, we're going to address all of these spaces, not necessarily today, but
Okay.
as we do at the time, and
Fine,
various
thank you.
configurations of those.
So just starting with the central area, and we've identified 3 clusters of jobs here that we were calling downtown, the West Shore Core, and the Tampa International Airport Anderson Road corridor. Together, these include about 24% of the jobs countywide. Today, well, in 5 years, after the projects that are in our current 5-year funded work programs are built, where will we be in terms of our traffic congestion? And that's what you have here on this map. The roads that are shown widest carry more than 120,000 cars a day. And the darker red the color, the more overcapacity, the more congested they are. So this is where we think we're going to be in 5 years if we build the things that are in our 5-year work program. Not everything's perfect, but we do have a number of roads that are functioning pretty well. In 2040, if we build nothing between 2018 and 2040, and we have the growth that we think is going to come to this county, of course, our traffic congestion would get a lot worse. So when we're identifying possible projects that might be needed, this is usually where we start. This is sort of our do-nothing scenario, our problem statement. How do we deal with the congestion that would be here? And so you can see there are a number of our major corridors that are way over capacity. The dark red is they're more than 50% over capacity. One other thing that we might think about too as we look at the colors on this map is that the lighter colors, like the yellows and the oranges that are, say 10% over capacity or, up to 30% over capacity, we might be able to deal with those corridors with some other types of projects. Like some of the projects that we talked about at a previous meeting, like making the traffic signals work more efficiently, or doing some travel demand management strategies, or promoting telecommuting and doing a lot of outreach on that. So there are a lot of strategies that we could look at short of adding the lanes. But if you were going to start looking at where to add the lanes, let's focus on those big dark red and some of the dark orange corridors. So some of the capacity projects that have been identified in this area in the past, I'm going to start with the long-range plan that was adopted 5 years ago. And the plan at that time identified special use lanes in the interstate corridors. The Department of Transportation has done some additional research since then, looking at how many lanes can fit, and would there be enough demand for those lanes if they were tolled to generate enough funding to make those feasible. So generally right now, the initial plan, FDOT's initial plan, contemplates one express lane in each direction, with the exception of a small segment that's a little west of downtown Tampa. So it's generally one lane in each direction on I-275 and I-4. So that'll help a little bit. It doesn't solve the whole problem. As you saw, those interstate highways are in the 50% overcapacity range. So we're still going to need something to supplement that. In our last plan, we did show light rail connecting our central business areas, airport, West Shore, downtown USF, an interchange reconstruction at 275 and State Route 60, and one of the downtown projects extending Whiting Street to Meridian. Other things have been identified since then. So, for example, the first 3 bullet points you see here under recently or currently under study, the West Shore Multimodal Center study was conducted to look at how do you connect, how do you fit transit into the interstate system and provide a connection to the rest of the region. A people mover from there to the airport is now being looked at by the Department of Transportation. And then we've also looked at the concept of reducing the cost of that light rail concept by reusing existing track, using a heavier vehicle, but that would still fit in the urban system. So these are some concepts that have been floated since 2009. Also looking at bus rapid transit and express toll lanes on 275. But there are other things besides that that you might start thinking about as you look at that red and orange map. For example, Hillsborough Avenue between the Veterans and Dale Mabry Highway, it's congested today. It's a lot worse in 2040. It has a lot of lanes out there today. Do we start talking about widening that to 8 lanes? That creates another really large cross-section like we have on Fowler Avenue. Dale Mabry Highway, the Department of Transportation has started talking about should that be widened as well, all the way from Hillsborough Avenue down to MacDill Air Force Base. So these are some new concepts that are being floated. Moving up to the university area. This area right around the university, and then we've also included here the Temple Terrace Telecom Park area and the new Tampa area around the I-75 interchange. This includes about 9% of all of the jobs countywide. That's in 2010 numbers. Right now, our worst problems are probably on I-75 in this quarter and on a part of Fowler Avenue. Looking out to 2040, again, I-75 really pops out, parts of Fletcher Avenue and Fowler, and I-275 as well. So again, we're talking about the express toll lanes that the department has looked at. Again, this is 1 lane in each direction. Doesn't solve the whole problem. So we are also looking at that light rail connection to connect this area to downtown. Other projects that have been suggested in the past, the new Tampa Boulevard extension and widening that to make it a complete 4-lane segment from Bruce B. Downs Boulevard all the way over to I-275. So that would be a possible reliever for Bruce B. Downs Boulevard. 131st Street widening, and Fletcher Avenue widening that east of Bruce B. Downs over to I-75. Other things that have been floated, we've talked about, what do we do with Fowler? It's 8 lanes, it's a high crash area, it's congested today, it's going to be more congested in the future. Is there anything else we can do with this? One suggestion that has been floated is separating out express lanes and local lanes with medians in between them to create more of a boulevard concept. So that might be one idea that has not been extensively studied but has been at least floated. Bus rapid transit and express toll lanes on the interstates under study right now. And again, looking at some kind of hybrid rail concept, reusing existing track as a way to lower the cost of rail service. One thing that hasn't been identified in the past is Bruce B. Downs Boulevard, south of where it's currently being widened. So
Excuse
maybe
me, Beth,
bringing.
we have a question.
Yeah,
Stand up.
Beth, help me understand on potential capacity projects. You're showing here new Tampa Boulevard, extend and widen I-275 to Bruce B. Downs. There's no on-ramp at 275.
Right, this would
Where
be.
would that traffic go?
That would have to be a new interchange on 275. This was also called the New Tampa East-West Road. You may know it by that name, but it has been studied quite extensively. There's been a PD&E study. There have been several toll feasibility studies for that corridor. It would basically skirt kind of an environmental land that's up at the apex where 275 and 75 come together. So this is a project that's been floated to help deal with the traffic congestion in that area.
Mr. Wagner?
Beth, have we ever taken these plans that looked at road capacity and overlaid them with HART's transportation plan to see if there's any correlation as far as the amount of capacity that we have on some of our existing transportation lines, whether, have we looked at that?
The HART bus lines are all integrated into the model as well. So yeah, that's a great question. And they do complement the capacity of the roadway system. They, add a little bit to that.
But I guess the question is where we're seeing a large amount of congestion and overcapacity, does that correlate? I mean, are we showing a correlation that our existing lines that are running along those segments, are they also running at full capacity? That's what I'm kind of looking for. I'm looking for the overlay. Where are we at with existing transportation where we're at in capacity on our roadways?
Sure. Well, we have just been looking at, the downtown and the USF area, and those corridors in between are some of the highest ridership corridors for HART. So there is definitely at least some correlation there.
Are we going to be able to see that? Is there some plan to show us where existing transportation is at maximum capacity and how that compares to where we're at capacity on the roadways?
Sure, we could produce that. So if you'd like to see these maps with the bus routes overlaid on them.
I guess I'm getting back to the point that I made before, is that I'm having some expectations that as we start talking about transportation options and things and economic corridors, that we're going to start merging and start showing the overlays of HART's transportation plans and their vision, and start putting some of all this together.
Sure, and it's a very important question. How do we integrate those things? I think one of the challenges that we have when we start talking about roadway capacity and level of service, and I'm just going back to the standard definitions of level of service and how we calculate it. The challenge that we have with buses that are operating on the roads in the traffic is that they're sitting in the same traffic as everybody else. So if we're talking about a bus route that, let's say it comes once every 30 minutes. And so once every 30 minutes, you have a vehicle that instead of carrying one person in it, it carries 12 or 15 people on it. So you've increased the capacity a little bit of that roadway. I don't think that we're going to see a change in the level of service calculation for that roadway if you're talking about a 30-minute bus service. We need to be talking about dedicated right-of-way for transit if you're talking about using transit to add capacity to the transportation system.
Let's go ahead, Beth.
Couple of questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Hess.
The first one would be up in the northern area, the possibilities of looking at an additional exit off the interstate at Bush Boulevard. Has there been any discussions or any interest in looking at that?
On I-75?
Yes, on I-75.
I haven't heard of that, but we could certainly ask the question.
Because there's a great deal of traffic that gets off on Fowler that then turns around and goes south into Temple Terrace. And when you look at Bush Boulevard and the Temple Terrace redevelopment district and Busch Gardens and the draw where Busch Gardens is pulling from, it would make sense to have an exit there. And as we look at developing that corridor, because looking at these maps, it's becoming very obvious that we have 4 emerging urban districts, not just downtown. And since we can't build enough roads and pay for enough transportation for everybody to go downtown, we may be looking at 4 different downtowns where people are working. So we have shorter trips.
The DOT at the time they were planning I-75 adopted a procedure that they would not put on and off ramps any closer than X number of miles. That was incorporated into, and I sat on that advisory committee. I remember very well the discussions about leaving out Bush Boulevard. But they adopted those procedures for the development. I don't know if we could go back in and convince them to put a ramp in there.
Get the mayor sitting next to you. Is there any interest on Temple Terrace's part about having that kind of access?
Well, that will certainly open up opportunities if the numbers warranted that work to be done there. There has been discussion in the past, but it's only gone to a certain point. But certainly at 301, it certainly would alleviate a lot of traffic on the Fowler Avenue corridor, because that is bumper to bumper in rush hour traffic. Some of it does go south, as you indicated. Some gets off and heads up 301. 301 is a pretty major artery there as well. That would help certainly disperse some of that congestion that builds up in those areas that you've mentioned.
Commissioner Merman?
Thank you. And I want to just expand on Commissioner Beckner's very good question, because I think what I'm a little concerned about, I guess, is that overlay. And also, as I understand the way this group is going to work, that, correct me if I'm wrong, our next segment is going to be bringing back to us key economic areas. Then we're going to go to transportation options to help connect everything, and then we'll go to funding. Is that correct? Okay. So you, in my opinion, I guess MPO looks like you kind of jumped the gun a little bit without knowing where those key economic areas are. I think, are you planning on overlaying on top, taking what you have and overlaying on top of what we come up with? Are you coming up with that, or who's kind of driving the ship here?
If I may, let me
Or
reply to
steering
that.
the ship, driving the car?
Riding the railroad train, whatever.
I'm a Navy woman.
Okay. Commissioner, Beth, if you could put up the key economic space map. We developed these based on the data. We believe these are existing key economic spaces,
Right.
and this is where jobs are. Now, what Ron's going to present to you shortly are the competitive sites, which are the additional and future spaces. So from that perspective, we will have either identified now or fairly quickly in the future what we believe the data generates are the key economic spaces of the county where there will be job growth and everything, and this slide shows that. What we'll start bringing you in January is for each key economic space or some grouping of those key economic spaces. What's going to be the road capacity in 2018 in 5-year increments if we can? What do you need to put in there to maintain the competitiveness of that space? So we'll try to build over time a map of what needs to be added. And then we'll aggregate all that up at a county level so you can see it from a countywide perspective also. But we want to begin to move to you to show here's what the projects are that we, staff believe, need to be added in so that this space continues to work well. And
Okay,
that's our
so
goal.
are you all working together? Okay.
Beth sees us, she turns and runs when she sees me now, actually, to tell you
Okay.
the truth.
That's, I just want to make sure that we're not getting, you know, something from MPO, something from HART, something from all these different organizations, and that it's not being integrated all
Sure.
into one piece.
Yeah, all these organizations meet every Friday, or wait, meet tomorrow, actually. So all of your staff here, as well as MPO Planning Commission, we meet every week to work through this stuff. So we're trying very hard to make sure we're integrated and communicating, and nobody's going on some tangent that's not proper. You know, we're working very hard, and I believe that's occurring. I mean, these folks work very hard together. So.
But those are great questions, and we have a great opportunity with the timing of this project that it matches up really closely with that analysis process that all of the counties were going to go through this spring. And it's only once every 5 years that you get all the counties lined up to do this planning process together to evaluate would investing in a particular road be a good idea or not? Would it solve a problem? So we're just at the beginning of that process, and really the purpose of this is more to get you thinking about what would you like us to test, and then bring back to you the results. because we have that capacity over the next few months to do some testing, see what you think of this result, come back and do another iteration, try it again. So in the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If I could summarize, then, if I'm thinking, if I understand completely, is that the MPO right now, we're looking at road capacity per se, and not where necessarily transportation lines and projects are going to go. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
This particular exercise focuses essentially on projects that would require right-of-way of some kind, whether it's a transit project or whether it's additional lanes. You know, sort of think about it as, you know, it's going to need some right-of-way. It's going to need some space.
So if we were then to take where you're looking at right-of-way and space, and I go to the HART plan, they would have, or they would be looking at some potential transportation projects or lines that are in that would require that. We're not looking at you creating what transportation projects should go to, because I think that's HART's position to look at the modes of transportation. That's working congruently together. So we're not going to see a disconnect when we're looking at what HART's plan is and what you're looking at as right-of-way in space.
That's exactly right. We're working with HART on a continuous basis.
Okay.
Any questions? I'm going to ask Beth just to illustrate a couple of other these. We're not trying to get detailed conversation. We're going to just show method today. So maybe if you pick one more and show that, and then we'll move on to some other stuff.
Okay.
Well, my
I'm sorry.
only concern, coming back to this New Tampa Boulevard capacity project, my concern is that we offer a solution that we can't carry out. If the DOT is not going to put a ramp there, then we shouldn't include this and try to merge it in with an express bus that can't get off there.
I believe that has been studied. Typically, the kind of study you would do is called an interchange justification report. And I think that was done for this road. But if not, there has definitely been a lot of coordination with the DOT because the Turnpike Enterprise actually did one of the studies of toll feasibility. And they're an arm of the DOT.
And Ms. Devon, let me also say, you know, our next phase, once we have these concepts out, is to start looking at, you know, what's feasible, what's buildable, financial analysis, et cetera. So we're trying to do it pretty systematically and realistically. And I also want to acknowledge that FDOT participates periodically in our project management meetings, so we're in communication
Well,
with them.
I share Commissioner Chris' concern that
Sure.
some of these solutions, if DOT is not
Right.
going to follow through or doesn't have it on their plan and doesn't intend to have it on their plan, then there's no sense of us trying to segment it into local plan.
Well, you said DOT comes periodically?
Yes, ma'am.
That's a concern, because they're a funder, a big funder. Actually, I thought they should have been a member at this table, but they need to be at every meeting.
And I think as we are in this phase, we may well be able to get that, you know, so I hear your concern and we'll address it, so.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll just skip to the end of the presentation, and we'll come back and talk more later about the specific projects. You know, like I said, we'll be at this for a number of months, and you know, we do have the maps here for you to have an opportunity to, you know, look over them in some detail. Please call me if you have any suggestions.
I guess what screams out at me, the economic development areas are all within areas that are already built out, for the most part. We have some capacity in the eastern part of the county, southern part of the county, but our predominant economic development areas that you identified here are in built-out areas. Dr. Paulzine says we're expecting 500,000 people, and we're averaging 2% growth, so about 24,000 per year. It's already miserable now. I was in West Shore trying to get to Lemon Street, and there was a lot of congestion this morning, but I was talking to the business folks there, and they were saying, we're looking for a way out because it's so challenging. So, two questions. One, what impacts land use more? Adding 2 lanes of road, I'm not going to ask for the answer today, but just curious. We look out at other areas. You've got congested areas that are built out that are growing. what will impact land use more? Adding 2 lanes to these arterials or transit? Because are we trying to adjust and change land use, or are we just hoping for more of the same? And for the next 20 years, 500,000 people, it's already congested today, what will have the greatest impact on land use out 20 years? Are we trying to just float along, or are we going to try to, in some ways, not necessarily direct, but create an environment which might change our existing land use patterns?
And I appreciate you not asking us to answer that today,
Yeah,
although
that's not for-
Melissa will start to address that. Commissioner Chris?
And I will add another dimension to what he's saying, and that's a fourth, and that is, would it be more financially sensible for us in our 20-year planning to look at maybe identifying and cultivating 4 live-work districts so we have less of a commute for people? For an example, those who work in West Shore live in West Shore. Those who work in the university area live in the university area. Because to think that all these, as we sprawl in all these outlying areas emerge, to think that we're all going to have to move them to downtown in the morning and from downtown in the evening is just not going to be financially feasible.
And again, I will say, I think as Melissa makes her presentation, some of that will start to get formed to you, and that's a great discussion that you'll need to have at this table, which will begin today. So, thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
As I said, the current space, what you've seen so far, the current spaces, as you're aware, the county's working on competitive sites, which are going to be new spaces. I'm going to ask Ron to give you an update on that. So, Ron, if you will.
Let's see if I can find me.
Let's see, where are you?
On the whole thing. Good afternoon. It's pleased to be with you. It's Ron Barton, Director of Economic Development for the county. Walking you through this conversation, what we wanted to share with you today was some conversation about the competitive sites and its relevancy to transportation decision-making. For some of you, particularly my board, you've heard some of this conversation, but we have some graphics that we want to share with you. But also for the other members of the committee, I'd like to walk through a little bit of our work. In context to what you've been presented today, this conversation is really about what are the next generation sites that speak to specifically kind of our targeted industry strategy. So this, I say to people, this isn't about where the next shopping mall goes or the next rooftops go. This is a narrow band of conversation about how we use scarce resource, which is land, to generate some of our objectives associated with the economy, which is higher wage jobs where we can. So that's really the genesis for competitive sites. And what I wanted to do is get a blank screen, and let's see what's next. Okay. I really want to pick up where Beth left off and try to relate the sites conversation to everything that you've been talking about. And obviously, we're just starting the conversation, not ending the conversation. But we've just genericized what Beth has done. We picked up some of the main transportation arteries in our system. And again, it's kind of repeating, in essence, what Beth shared with you in detail. But the fact of the matter is, even in this section, which is 2018 only, clearly we have a transportation system under duress. And now the question is, what does it really have to do with the narrow band of conversation related to growing our economy? One of the things that we did here, and I encourage you throughout this presentation just to look at the big picture, because we're still scrubbing a lot of the information, but we map targeted industries. The reason you see some dispersion in the county is because we also mapped agriculture, because agriculture is a fundamental part of our targeted industries strategy, so it's a little bit misleading here, but go with it for today. But the fact of the matter is these are dots that are variation on the theme to what Beth and Melissa have shared with you, but these are our targeted industries. So it's not every job center in Hillsborough County. It's a narrower band of jobs that are in our targeted industry segments. So, and again, your dispersion in this map is fundamentally because of manufacturing and agriculture. Otherwise, the aggregation of dots are exactly what you would expect. So they match up to some extent clearly with the key economic spaces that you've been talking about already, excuse me. And so West Shore, downtown, along the interstate corridor, a looser grouping in the 301 75 corridor, and then of course in the USF area. So you're not seeing anything really fundamentally different. It's just this is a narrower band of data associated with targeted industries. Something that I wanted to continue to kind of remind you as you looked at transportation is that we are a regional economy. It's not just Hillsborough County. So a soundbite for you to remember is about 1/6 of the jobs in Hillsborough County are filled by people outside of our county. So those transportation gateways to our community are critical, and frankly, they'll be more critical in the future. I think our economy will continue to evolve and strengthen, and the bigger it gets, the more we'll be reliant on each other in terms of neighboring counties. And so what you see on these arrows is inflows and outflows associated with commuting patterns. And no surprise to see, for instance, if you go over to the Pinellas side linked to us, about 41,000 coming from Pinellas into our marketplace. And not surprisingly, if you drive the Howard Franklin Bridge, 29,000 of our residents going over to Pinellas. Again, not a surprise if you've lived here a long time, but look at the number for Pasco. At one time, Pinellas was clearly the leader in terms of sending people into our economy. Now Pasco actually is outpacing Pinellas. So I just remind you, it's not just about moving people in Hillsborough County. If we can't get that workforce in, those companies are looking at a workforce and they don't care where the boundaries are. They don't care about a municipal boundary. They don't care about a county boundary. And so I just want to remind you, continue to remind you, that primary center, the expressways, the interstate systems, our bridges are still a critical part of Hillsborough County's economy. And so I just wanted to remind you of that. The next thing that, I think this just did the same thing. Oh, okay, here we go. Sorry, lost myself. The one thing that I think is important, and you talk about transition from transportation and jobs to land use. Something to continue to remind ourselves, because looking at a map of Hillsborough County is very misleading. And so if you look at this map, the grayed areas are not developable areas in our county. Those are ELAP properties, those are state, local, national park systems, they are mining properties, and so just for context, visually, that's an important map for you to kind of consider because you know, the availability of land in our community is a very scarce resource. And it's a reminder that, in essence, the gray areas of this map are not available to solve your problems, whether they are for houses or for jobs. And so that's an important aspect just visually for you. And then lastly, for our conversation today, what we've chosen is to just kind of conceptualize the primary competitive sites areas. You're not going to be surprised, but basically the shift is to the 75 corridor. That's where our land is. The sites are where the road systems are. And so underneath that, and the thing that's lost in translation for this graphic is that we didn't do the heat map based on square footage or acreage. And so, for instance, the amount of entitlements for development for office in downtown and West Shore are still very significant. So if you were to graph them based on entitlements for square footage development, those heat areas for West Shore and downtown are going to basically heat up. I'd like to speak to something that Commissioner Sharp said, and basically it's to give you a different perspective. The fact of the matter is we aren't substantially built out, and we can turn back inward in a number of cases, and that's not just downtown and West Shore, but it's the University of South Florida area, and it's certainly the 75 corridor area. So our future, our near-term future for job creation is still along the corridors that we know and appreciate as commuter corridors for our workforce today. So there's no magical next conversation about transportation. It's in front of you, whether it was Beth's presentation or ours on the next generation sites. Now, will this look different when we look at the sites that will transform as 20 years from now? Sure it will. We'll start to stretch out to the I-4 corridor. We'll look at other things, but these are sites that we want to position to change our destiny for job creation in the next decade. And so the road network and the deficiencies in that road network that Beth talked about are completely germane to whether these sites will be competitive. So we could spend a lot of time helping the sites themselves get positioned, and yet if the road system can't service it, that site is no longer relevant. We might solve the wetlands issues. We may get water and sewer extended to the site. We may take away, traffic signal obligations for the developer. We could do lots of things to position that site better, but if this constrained road system is not addressed, then that site's going to be irrelevant. I mentioned to you kind of what's the outcome of our work, and again, it's really to help in better decision-making on all fronts. And that's not just transportation, that's land use planning, that's infrastructure spending in your CIP, so it's all of those things. But I did want to kind of return back and say, what are we going to drive out of the competitive sites analysis? And the basic buckets to think about are that we're going to bring, because of that detailed data, we're going to bring recommendations to you that are associated with how we could engage on on-site constraints so that those sites could win deals quicker and move forward quicker. We're going to bring to you the aggregation of off-site constraints because there are developer obligations associated with development, but they're off-site, and we need to have a better, firm understanding of what those are. We're going to bring you insights, I think, on better regulatory processes that might be able to position those, and fee structures, an example. So it's a lot of the conversation that was driven out of the EDA Planning Commission study, but the details associated with the analysis of these sites will give us a better feel for recommendations on policies and tools. And then lastly, I would just say we've started with ourselves. What I mean by that is we're analyzing the sites in the unincorporated because we are able to pull that out of our planning processes. We are now working with the city of Tampa, Temple Terrace, and Plant City to basically populate the same things. Again, scale-wise, Temple Terrace and Plant City are going to have a fairly finite number of positions to do that. The cities are reflected not just exclusively in the downtown DRI and the West Shore DRI, but that's certainly two of the biggest. So that's our process. That's what we're in currently. But I wanted to share that with you. And again, even if you look at the cursory mapping of these future sites, they're on these corridors that we know we have to rely on today as well.
So I guess this kind of goes back to the same point, and I'll keep on hitting it back, because I don't know, maybe I'm looking at things too simply, but I see three segments here that are the key to what we're discussing around transit and infrastructure. We started with the MPO, we're talking about capacity, we're talking about right-of-way and the underlying infrastructure to outlay for transit. We're talking economic development, which has been one of our focus. What are the key economic areas? What I see are all these things overlaying one another and looking at what's on Hart's vision plan, what's on our existing networks, and seeing where are the capacities being met, where are our strengths, and where are the areas around the economic developments that we need to improve as far as infrastructure and transit. Am I on the right track? Am I thinking the right way, or am I thinking too simply?
Absolutely.
Said it far better than
Yeah.
I. That's exactly what we're trying to do, is overlay these things to identify your priority projects.
Okay.
I think one way to think about it is you're using the economic criteria, the information that's coming to you, in essence, as a tiebreaker, because everything's important. I mean, the fact of the matter is, from the presentation about how we compare benchmarked across the board, you're not going to have enough money to solve all problems, so you need tiebreakers in decision-making. And one of the things I think you're willing to consider is the economic criteria may very well be a tiebreaker among many necessary projects.
Yeah.
That's one way to look at it,
I
too.
mean, for me, obviously, for transportation, it's making, my number one priority is to make sure that we have an adequate transportation structure for our citizens, businesses. They can get to one point A to one point B, and to point B in the most efficient manner. And yes, we need to focus that around economic development. And that's where I see where if we look at and we lay down the key areas of where we want to focus economic development at in our county, and then we start looking at the infrastructure and what transportation, the transit options look like, and the transit infrastructure looks like in that area, that's how we can start making key decisions as far as, do we have adequate transit infrastructure in that area, or is that something that we need to build? And then we can prioritize with using our economic development areas as part of our criteria. Obviously, we have to look at other parts of our community where there's mass commuters or citizens living to make sure that they have viable transportation options as well too. So as you can see, I'm just a little bit anxious to start marrying things together and start bringing forth recommendations.
The targeted industries, some of these, like along the I-75 corridor, are we talking about industries which are going to be heavily concentrated on manufacturing, where the mission is to actually make a product, and unless we're moving it out by drone, shipping it on the road, which means the road would be more important, or for, trucks and such? Are there going to be some areas where it's going to be 9 to 5? I mean, where it's going to be workers, but not product. I was actually this morning at a business where they're coming up with building a drone that can move beer. I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was interesting.
You mean you could get it ice cold
Just that
delivered to your house?
I don't know. I just thought that was pretty wild. Yeah. Mira and I are going to test it out. We're going to see if it works. We're going to see if it works. But
St. Patrick's Day.
But some industries that we're going to be, I'm interested. I guess I am interested in when you look at industries, what's coming and going, people, goods, and does that make a difference? Obviously, I think it would, as to what type of improvements we would make. Transit might not mean as much in areas where the emphasis is going to be on moving lots of manufactured goods. Transit might be more important if it's more commercial and or retail commercial, or am I correct? And are we thinking about those things?
Certainly, different land uses are going to have requirements on the roadway system, but, like you said, you're correct. I mean, you're either moving workers, or you're moving visitors, or you're moving goods. That's probably an oversimplification, but those are three drivers in our economy. And so, there's commonalities in all three of those users to what they need out of a system. And then there's differences, associated with times of use and strain on the road system. And so what we don't have here clearly is we haven't shown either targeted industries or future sites associated with, for instance, we've graphed industrial and office. You're going to graph industrial, you're going to map industrial and attack industrial lands differently than you will office. Right. We've just grouped them here just for sake of generalized discussion.
As we look inside the key economic spaces, obviously we differ in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
The CSX and all is different from U.S. or now. And as staff look at that, the packages will be different because of that. Different needs and stuff, so we're certainly attempting to be very responsive and turn myself off. But anyway, yes, sir. That's the work.
Me.
Somebody else had it.
Um,
Commissioner.
Okay, and again, piggybacking on Commissioner Beckner, his goal, but I do think there is a second goal, and that's to make sure that this is a very cost-effective and affordable solution, that we can document, take all this data we're doing, and back up the decisions for making the economic sites, for the transportation options, and the funding options, because we've got to, you know, we need the public to engage in this conversation and almost approve it so that when we make our decisions, they'll be right alongside of us. Number of cars off the road, how many people we can move, the cost of people moving, you know, through areas. I think all that has to come along with it, and I just want to make sure that we are collecting that data so that we can go back to, because that was a problem with the other referendum. There wasn't this depth of information, and I just want to make sure we cover all the bases.
I'd add one other item that is very hard to measure, but I think is real in our future, and that is lack of engagement in a substantive way to these issues is loss of market share. So it isn't just about, you know, capacity changes of level of service on a road. All you have to do is look at major metropolitan areas over their history of evolution, and they're going to gravitate to the outside. Land's cheaper. What gets permitted quickest is rooftops. Rooftops is workforce. And so if you don't continue to make your inner core county, which is us, relevant from an economic perspective, then there's also the loss of market share. Basically, we create the donut that we don't want. We don't want to be the distressed county. We don't want to be the underperforming county. And so that's a hard thing to get citizens to understand, but to me, it's almost more real than anything else. It means this county becomes less relevant economically if we don't do these things.
I
Chris?
think it's the heart and soul of this community has got to be downtown Tampa. That's got to be the nucleus where the spokes of the wheel come out from that. Now, granted, the spine is over there, and that's like the outside of the wheel that's going to encompass our community. But I think we all have to recognize that downtown Tampa is going to be the nucleus for us. Couldn't agree anymore.
Yeah, Mayor, would you like to disagree with that?
Commissioner Merman is brilliant.
Commissioner Chris?
I guess that means that New Tampa is going to get recognized as a part of Tampa eventually. But there's also two aspects here, too, when we start communicating this to the public that need to be measured and looked at as well. And I mean, the bottom line of all of this, it all has to equal quality of life. Whether it's jobs, whether it's shortening commutes, whether it's improving travel times, whatever. It all equates down to one single message to the voter: quality of life. And an aspect of that that also needs to be considered here and measured is if we are able to take more vehicles off the road, shorten commutes, what kind of impact, positive impact, will that have on the environment? As you look at the Atlanta area, you look at LA, you look at the areas that have all these roads, and you look at their pollution levels and their quality of life and their health care issues as a result of it, that plays a significant factor in there.
Let me go to Commissioner Miller, and then I'd like to move to Melissa because y'all are giving her all kind of setups, and we need to give her a chance to respond. Commissioner Miller?
I understand that Commissioner Merman is brilliant because Mayor Buckhorn said so because of downtown Tampa. Maybe that's because of where the decisions were made. But I just was talking to Commissioner, what's your name again? Sharp.
And he's sharp.
And when we're talking about the target industry area along I-75, which would then tie into probably I-275, that's where the hub is going to be. And it's going to affect Temple Terrace, of course. It's going to affect Plant City. But I sit here and say, you know, I drive I-75 and I drive I-275, and right now, it's not a pretty picture. It really, really is not a pretty picture. So how do we plan for those target industries coming in there today. You know, we look at I-275 and what's going on now around the West Shore area, and it's like Atlanta. Atlanta never quits building roads. They try to build their way out of it, it just doesn't work. You know, you got a level D road, by the time they finish working on it, it's still a level D, a double D, which is big, okay? It'll come to you pretty soon. It'll come to you.
I got you.
So, you know, so when do we start, and I think Commissioner Sharp asked the question earlier, when do we start thinking about downtown is important, we know that, decisions are made downtown in Tampa that affects the county. Decisions are made in Temple Terrace and Plant City, which affects those areas. But when do we start thinking about, okay, we know we want to have a target industry, we're going to have a target industry around the I-75, I-40 area. We know that we're going to have certain areas where we're going to be looking at economic development, but when do we start talking about how do we move people around to get there? He said, well, we don't want to bring it up now. When the hell are we going to bring it up?
We're going to start bringing you in January packages for all those key economic spaces, many of which you just analyzed. So, yes, sir.
Keep staying tuned, we're going to be stayed out of business. I mean, you know.
We're there. May I ask Melissa to come up? Thanks, Ryan. Okay. Much of what y'all have talked about is in this blue circle land use, and as both several of you have said now, how you shape the growth and development of the community has a large impact on the transportation network. So Melissa's going to answer all the questions you've just asked here.
Wow, some high expectations here. Melissa Zornito with the Planning Commission staff, and I'm here to share with you the results of our Imagine 2040 outreach effort and where we head from here. And I think you'll be pleased to see it aligns with where you all have been discussing today. Again, we start with the context of Hillsborough County today with 1.3 million people and a number of the assets and constraints that we've been discussing through the course of the day. And this effort has been a way to get input from the public on how we shape the updates of our comprehensive plans and our long-range transportation plans. You all will hopefully remember that we provided 3 scenarios out to the public, the suburban dream, the bustling metro, and the new corporate centers. And we got 3,529 survey responses. And for a planning effort, we're really excited about that kind of a response. For a plan update, we've never had this kind of outreach and input from the community. Usually we're going around to high schools and we get 20 to 30 people coming in and giving us some comments. And we engaged people in a new way. We educated them and got some significant input in terms of detailed comments on some of these options that they were presented. So I'm sort of just covering the first layer of the results. There's even more details that we're continuing to analyze. We had a number of different ways people could give us input. The majority came through the website. We also went out to a large number of community meetings and had folks give us input through paper surveys. We had kiosks, iPads at community meetings. This map illustrates all the yellow and green dots, which are kind of hard to see. The different locations, either a kiosk or a community meeting was held at, because we really tried to get out all across the county, touched all the different parts of Hillsborough County to get a diversity of input. In terms of the results, we asked what were the 5 things that mattered to the person the most, and the top 3 were traffic congestion, job creation, and available bus or rail. So you all are here for exactly the right reason. Then it goes on to things such as what Commissioner Chris touched on: natural resources, efficient energy use, redevelopment potential. All of them were clearly important. There was some differentiation. We saw that those in the Plant City and Eastern County prioritized agriculture more, but this was the overall. Each of those priorities were, the public was given the opportunity to see how each of the scenarios weighed on those priorities that they chose. These are the 3 priorities. They were asked to give them 1 to 5 stars, 5 being the best. And overall, the survey results were that the bustling metro, which was the more infill and redevelopment focused scenario, got the highest number of 4 to 5 stars. And then the new corporate centers had the second most positive stars, and the suburban dream the third. And this is just a flavor of some of the comments we got about why people chose the bus lane metro. They saw it was focusing investment into an area with a bigger rate of return. It preserved things like our rural, agricultural, environmental assets. One comment was it will bring Tampa into the 21st century. There was a lot of comments about the impact of that type of a land use scenario on the transportation, that it would allow for opportunities where people could live closer to where they worked, offering opportunities for greater walking, public transit use, benefits for seniors who might not be able to drive. We asked a number of questions about some of the ingredients that went into those scenarios. We asked about what would be the best way to accommodate new homes looking out to 2040. The highest rated choices here were town centers with the places to live, work, and play, and a mix of townhomes and apartments, high-density residential and job centers, redevelopment of commercial corridors, and infill in existing areas. These were some of the photographs that were shown, and these options all had the most 4 to 5 star ratings. And we asked about best ways to accommodate jobs. And here the ones that got more 4 to 5 stars than 1 to 2 stars were existing job centers, redevelopment in existing corporate parks and industrial areas, and town centers with a mix of places to work. So again, these results are really validating things that have been in our plans for a while, things you all are talking about today, and with what we've heard from the public. In terms of transportation, the different options all got more positive stars than, more 4 to 5 stars than 1 to 2 stars. I thought this was really telling that what we need is a mix of all of these different types of options, that there's no one solution. But the highest rated ones were smart traffic signals and better intersections, sidewalk, bike lanes and trails, and commuter or light rail, and express or bus rapid transit. We did ask about funding and what would be the fairest and most reasonable way to pay for the infrastructure needed to support the growth. The highest rated ones were one-time fees on new development, tolls on new lanes, and sales tax. Unpopular picks that had more low ratings were utility taxes, sort of the do-nothing answer, which was no new taxes, maintain what we have, and property tax. And the gas tax and special assessment districts were sort of an even split between the high and low ratings. In terms of the respondents and where did they come from, it was optional for them to provide us their zip code. 64% of them provided a zip code that was in the county, 28% provided no zip code, 5% the zip code was from a neighboring county in our region, and 3% were somebody who was interested from far away. And it was heavily represented in the Tampa area, with 44% of the respondent zip codes coming from there. The others distributed. This is the map of how we have broken up the county to try to analyze this. Unfortunately, zip codes don't line up with jurisdictional boundaries or planning boundaries. So we've tried to group them together to see whether there was some differentiation in the results. In terms of their work status, the vast majority said that they worked outside of their home. 11% were retired or unemployed, 10% students, and 10% said they worked at or from their home. In terms of their activities in the county, we asked this to try and ascertain for those in particular who were from outside the county. Were they business owners? Did they live here, play or visit here, or work or go to school here? And the majority were some combination of those, which if you live here, you would be. And again, 92% of them were registered voters. So we had which really isn't that surprising, because if you're going to take the time to do a 5-minute online survey about planning, you're probably pretty active in your local government and interested in these types of issues. We did, as I said, look at the differentiation across the county of the ratings on the scenarios. It was very interesting to me to see that the bustling metro was the highest rated scenario across all the geographies. I thought there might be greater differentiation than there was. Plant City and East County and South County did rank those a little bit lower than the other areas of Hillsborough County. They rated the new corporate centers and suburban dream a little bit higher. In terms of transportation options, and this chart's a little bit challenging to look at, but the main thing to pull out of here is that those top four choices were sort of the top across the board, with the exception of Plant City East County that did not rate express bus or BRT or commuter or light rail as favorably. And again, this just sort of summarizes that, in terms of the priorities, the main differentiations were the East and South County portions of the geographies. They had more support for homes on rural lots, more support for agriculture, less support for high density in job centers. In terms of jobs, they were more supportive of the corporate center approach with new job centers and distribution centers along the interstates. So with this information in mind, we're now moving into our next phase of the plan updates, where we start to create what we're calling sort of a hybrid of all of these scenarios, and utilizing that to guide us as we do our plan. This hybrid or vision scenario would not be the plan. It simply would be a combination of the best of what we've heard, and then give us a tool to then start to test and figure out which of those things are realistic and feasible. What are the tools we can put in our comprehensive plan or our long-range transportation plan to make some of those things happen? Again, we're looking at basing this on a Bieber median projection, which means another 600,000 people here by 2040. And we're drawing on what we heard. What we're looking at in terms of the hybrid is that, as was just said, perfect timing, Tampa should be the job center of the region. A high quality of life is desired to attract high quality jobs. We want to continue to have choice of places to live, to work, to get ways to get around. Transportation should support creating jobs, that we should focus on our existing spaces and assets first, and that there's no silver bullet. It's going to take a little bit of all of it. It's a combination and a mix. And that's sort of what this graphic shows. Based on the results, we're going to try and focus on achieving that bustling metro, and that would be where we're put a large amount of our focus, but we're also going to need some new corporate centers and some suburban dream too, to make the mix work. Some of the policy directions we're looking at in terms of growth and land use in particular are to try and focus growth in our key economic spaces, encourage redevelopment better through our comprehensive plan, support continued infill growth within our urban service area, and then start the discussion about where, when, and how to expand the urban service area. Because to reach that 600,000 additional population, we're going to need to start looking at some new areas, probably along our interstate corridors. In terms of residential mix, this graphic just shows sort of the mix of all of it, infilling in our suburban areas, some transit-oriented development, connecting major activity centers, redevelopment, new suburban expansion areas, and then we always have some continued growth in our rural community. We want to maintain that lifestyle where people can live on a 5-acre lot as well. In terms of job growth mix, again, focusing in our existing areas, both the downtown West Shore and University, as well as our existing suburban areas, looking to other redevelopment opportunities, and then some new corporate centers in expansion areas along interstates. And in terms of the transportation mix, really, as we saw, there was support for all of the choices, and we need some of each, and we'll be looking for your guidance on what the right mix of those are. In terms of our next steps, we will be having an Imagine 2040 working group right here tomorrow night from 5 to 7, so I'll put in a little plug for that. We'll also be making presentations to the MPO committees, hopefully to the city councils, other community groups. We want to continue the discussion with the community, with the jurisdiction staffs about what the right mix of all of these is, and then what we can do in terms of the plans to make those happen, and as Beth said, start to test some of those alternatives, those policy choices. And we'd welcome any guidance you have at this point, any direction, and happy to answer any questions.
Direction they're going comfortable to, you guys?
I like nodding.
Any other questions? All right. Any other questions or comments from the group? I'd like to thank you for your time today. Happy holiday season. We will see you in January with projects. Thank you.